Okay, what do you think? Should we get started? Ready to go?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Great. Well, welcome everybody. I know we have quite a few people signed up for this evening, so we expect folks to keep joining throughout the evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for attending the next in our series of Urban Design Committee presentations. And this evening, we're joined by the Access Knowledge Committee of the BSA to talk about a subject which is near and dear to any urbanist's heart, which is to say streets, and in particular sort of the recent evolution of our streets that we've seen across the United States, if not across the world, in terms of what the pandemic has brought for our streetscapes that we know and love so well. Streets have long been considered among the greatest urban spaces created by humans. From the Via Appia to the Champs-Élysées, from Nanjing Road to Copacabana, streets are the negotiated terrain of public life. From our own iconic streets of Commonwealth Avenue, Newbury Street, Boylston, and Hanover Streets downtown, to all of our great neighborhood main streets across Boston and throughout the Commonwealth. They're amongst the most enduring places in our cities, where neighbors rub shoulders with visitors, students, workers, and just about everybody else. While we've come so far in the last 10 years with the advent of complete streets and healthy streets and walkable streets and tactical urbanism and temporary paintings of streets which go on throughout most of the cities now in the world, if not the United States, nothing has really quite prepared us for the current situation. The pandemic has jump-started efforts to reconsider the way city streets are used. While some efforts were already underway, municipalities and communities appear more willing to experiment during this current crisis. Having planned these experiments in the spring, I should have forwarded my slide here. Having planned these experiments in the spring and implemented them in the summer, autumn seems like the appropriate time to take stock of what we have learned as we move into the colder months. So tonight we're joined by a panel of experts who will discuss the new roles streets have taken during the pandemic and describe some of the initiatives that cities have undertaken and evaluate the successes and challenges that have arisen. This discussion takes place within a whole other larger context of an understanding of equitable access to shared spaces, where equity speaks not only to issues of social justice, but also issues of universal design. So we're joined tonight by Vineet Gupta, Martina Haggerty, Lydia Hassel, and Leanne Taylor, who will each be introduced at the beginning of their presentation. As I mentioned, this event is co-sponsored by the Access Committee, joined by Josh and Ian, and the Urban Design Committee, Rami and myself, Martin Zogren. So during the presentation tonight, please be sure to mute yourself unless you're presenting. And if you do have questions for our speakers, we'll have a Q&A at the end, and please put those questions into chat. So Rami, I'll let you introduce the first speaker. Stop sharing.
Good evening. It's my pleasure. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Vineet Gupta, who is the Director of Planning for the Boston Transportation Department. In that role, he has directed the city's recently published transportation plan, Go Boston 2030, and its national award-winning Complete Streets Guideline. His team designs and implements Vision Zero-related safety projects, bike and bus lanes, manages the Blue bike share system, and redesigns major corridors and squares with a focus on the public realm. He is currently spearheading the installation of tactical plazas and mobility hubs. His work is driven by an extensive public process with a proven record of removing barriers to encourage participation by everyone. His Master of Architectural Studies and Master of City Planning degrees are from MIT. Vineet.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. There we go. Are you getting the full screen or are you getting the side panel as well? There we go. So thank you, Rami, for the kind introduction. Let me start by reiterating the situation we're in today. Clearly, it's a crisis which is unprecedented. And from a travel perspective, if you compare the numbers to the pre-COVID baseline, car travel has rebounded about 70% in the Suffolk County area. While this is depressing, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to reimagine our streets, repurpose our streets as there's less traffic on our streets. Weekday bus ridership has rebounded 41% compared to pre-pandemic levels. But it's interesting if you go to the next level of detail, there are some routes, particularly where ridership is most trans-dependent, where ridership has rebounded even more to 60 to 70%. But this gives us an opportunity to focus on those very corridors and provide bus priority, something that we were planning to do in years ahead, but do that right off the bat this year. Finally, subway ridership has only rebounded 25%. And we really have to work with the MBTA to make it safer to ride the subway. One interesting anecdote, not anecdote, but kind of statistic here is that the Fairmont line, which is a commuter rail line wholly in Boston, has also rebounded about 24 to 25% compared to the rest of the commuter rail system, which has only rebounded about 8 to 10%. So we are seeing some rebounds, but we're also seeing immense opportunity to reimagine our streets, to rethink how people can travel in Boston and in the Boston area. But really, we have to kind of put our work in a larger context. And at the beginning, in general, for all activities that the city is engaged with, in the beginning, there was that when COVID cases started to increase, there was a kind of the immediate response that we needed to do. We have since transitioned from that into implementing programs that are kind of on the recovery side. What can we do now to make it easier to recover from the pandemic? And all of this leads up, obviously, to the post-pandemic area where we have to do things today so that we can thrive in the future. If this is how we're kind of looking at our approach to the pandemic in general, if you translate that to what we can do for streets. And what this means is that while we need to respond to some extent right off the, we needed to respond when the pandemic first started, it also gave us an opportunity then to accelerate or step up our planning. And as you'll see in a little bit, we started to do that. In the recovery time, it gives us an opportunity to start experimenting, to start installing pop-ups. And finally, by installing those pop-ups, it gives us an opportunity to do things differently when we make things permanent in the post-pandemic area. So this theme of step-up planning, installing pop-ups, and making things permanent, you'll find drives most of my presentation, and it drives my presentation in three main areas. I'm going to talk about what we are doing to make transit safe and reliable, mainly a focus on bus lanes. I'm going to talk about how this kind of underlying theme informs how we are creating connected bicycle routes throughout Boston. And finally, I'm going to talk about what we've done to support small businesses in Boston. This kind of three-step thing it looks very kind of abstract, and it is, and as you'll find that there are variations of how we did this. It's not always in this order. But we did have an immediate response before we did any of this. And it had to do with understanding that there was a huge demand for people driving up to do takeout food. And this is right in the early stages. We're talking March, April. And we actually rolled out over 100 of these takeout food pickup zones throughout the city near restaurants. We provided free blue bike passes for hospital staff. In fact, today, the MGH Blue Bike station is the busiest in the entire system. And it's obviously no longer South Station. And of course, our teams helped with food access. So the huge issue in the kind of when the whole pandemic started. So this was our immediate response. But all our thinking in terms of planning and pop-up lanes and making things permanent was really informed by an underlying reality. A reality that says that low-wage earners in communities of colors have had historical inequitable access to services. And COVID has made this worse. They are less likely to have jobs where they can work from home. They are more at risk for layoffs because they can't get to where they want to go to. There are fewer mobility choices of how to get there. And finally, they have limited access to even basic amenities such as health and childcare. And so this kind of underlying driver has informed a lot of the projects that we have, that you'll hear about. Let me start with transit, encouraging safe and reliable transit. The map that you see here are the busiest routes, bus routes in the Boston area. And so we had already been planning to identify specific routes in this network that we wanted to implement in the next 2, 5, 10 years. But what we did was we took this network and we identified specific corridors, about half a dozen corridors that we thought we should have, we should accelerate our implementation. And some of this work was already happening. It's not that we kind of selected these in March and have had success going forward. Most of them were already going. Most of them were informed by an existing public process that we had from 2019. So we felt confident that projects that you see on the right in the kind of in the darker blue were projects that we could implement. And in fact, we've gone ahead and implemented these. I won't go through this list here, but I will pull out 3 projects that are worth talking about. But of course, we did pop-ups. We did pop-ups actually a year and a half ago in Rosendale to provide a bus lane. This is the bus lane that goes from Rosendale Square to Forest Hill Station. And so we had that experience of how to do a pop-up for bus lanes. It was hugely successful. So in this case, we went straight from kind of the larger planning initiative to making things permanent. And what you see in the middle panel here is a photograph of Washington Street in downtown Boston. This allowed the Silver Line for people coming from kind of the underserved area of Roxbury, a 15-minute saving because all the congestion was in the downtown area. The photograph in the middle is Columbus Avenue to connect people from Eggleston Square to Jackson Square, to the Jackson Square T station. And again, huge savings. This is under construction right now. It will be the first center. In other words, the bus lanes are going to be in the middle of the street project in the region. And at the bottom is, I believe that's Washington Street in Rosendale, where we're putting a outbound lane, as we will in North Washington Street as well. So these are bus projects that are in construction or about to go into construction this year. You'll see all of them in the next month or so. Similarly, we looked at our bike routes. The map on the left is the Go Boston 2030 citywide transportation plan. That's the network we want to complete in the next 15 years. And so we said that let's kind of focus in on one of those areas that had, again, had a public process coming from 2019. So we could build on that. It was not something that was brand new. And this was in the Connect, what we call now called Connect Downtown. It's kind of a focus along the public garden on Tremont Street, actually all the way from State Street past the old State House to the kind of the Cambridge Street, Tremont Street corridor, and all the way down past the Boston Common, actually all the way to the Turnpike. Similarly, there's a focus on Arlington, Charles, around the public garden, and then Boylston Street from Arlington all the way to Tremont. And we've done some really creative stuff there, which I will be too much detail. But while we focused on downtown, we also focused in our neighborhoods. And Lydia and I were talking a second ago about American Legion Highway that kind of cuts across and connects neighborhoods. Similarly, Cummins Highway is deep in Mattapan. And so these are projects that had some planning background. We accelerated that planning. and using cones first. So on the left are pop-up lanes. The one top left is Charles Street on the public garden side, and on the left-hand side, the bottom is Columbus Avenue. So we did some cones, and we could do this overnight. In some cases, we had to remove them and put them back, but that's another longer story. But the middle panel, or rather the next 4 photographs, show how these have been made permanent. And on the top art is Tremont Street, where we've actually finished painting and providing flex posts. It's more on the kind of the Park Plaza area near the theater district. In the middle bottom is American Legion Highway, and of course at the bottom right is Washington Street itself, where we have that bus bike lane combination. So again, we in this case we kind of went the route of let's try the pop-ups and see what happens. And once we saw that that was successful, it would work, we make things permanent. And so we've gone from approximately 7.5 miles of protected bike lanes that we had previous to the pandemic, and we're adding 6 more miles. We would have added 6 more miles by the end of by Thanksgiving. And so again, it's a reimagining of our streets and taking advantage. That's not the right phrase in these times, but kind of using the opportunity to provide travel for people who bike and for people who take transit. Finally, we want to help small businesses. And so this is less about providing space for people to, do outdoor dining, and much more about providing jobs and saving businesses. And so that's what our focus was. What you see on this page is Hanover Street, Newbury Street, and on the bottom right, what you see is Stanhope Street near Back Bay Station. I call this page the pretty pictures page. It's great, but it's actually not the real story. It's great to have people and to reimagine our streets in this way. And as an urban designer and architect, I'm thrilled to see this. Absolutely, it's a complete transformation of our streets. But the real story is in the neighborhoods. And we made sure that we proactively did outreach. And of course, these photographs are taken right in the beginning when these things were set up, so you don't see them at all occupied like you saw in the previous photograph. But we've gone to a Fields Corner, we've gone to a Nubian Square, we've gone to Roxbury, we have worked hard with people in Eggleston Square, and we've been right down to Lower Mills. And so there is an effort to save businesses that are most troubled and hurting the most. This slide actually gives you some perspective. So on the left-hand side, you see all the licensed restaurants in the city of Boston. And then in the middle and on the right, from June to August, you see the applications that came in for outdoor dining. And so it kind of begins to resemble the map on the left, slowly but surely. But for those of you who know the city well, you'll notice on the map on the right that Dorchester Avenue has seen activity. Center and South Streets and Jamaica Plain have seen activity. Nubian Square obviously has seen activity. Good stuff in East Boston and Alston Brighton. And of course, we've seen activity in Mattapan as well. But we haven't seen the kind of activity that we'd really like to see. But this is huge progress. It came about through proactive outreach to neighborhood restaurants. We actually made a list of every minority-owned neighborhood in the entire city and tried to get out to those folks. And so that's what you see here in the slide, that over close to 500 restaurants were approved for outdoor dining. About half of them, or probably more than half, are minority or women or immigrant-owned, and about 122 were minority-owned. Outdoor dining has completely transformed how people look at streets in our city. And the mayor has made it very clear that he'd like to continue this program in 21 and in years forward. So look forward to seeing outdoor dining on our streets next year, the following year, and year after year. We have, I'm merely the ambassador. It's taken a team of a lot of people to kind of rethink our permitting system, rethink what we believe is right for our streets, convert a lot of people who have done things in a traditional way to think new. And so it takes effort. This is my final slide, and I say this only half in jest, but once you fabricate a sign, it probably means things are going to stay around for a long time, because somebody in some department actually designed these signs and somebody actually kind of installed them. And once that happens, I can tell you stuff is institutionalized and it's going to remain. And so again, I'm just the ambassador. There's a huge team, or the planning team, the engineering team, and our operations team, people who put stuff in the ground, had to work on this right from the design stage all the way to maintenance. So with that, thanks very much. Please visit boston.gov, healthy-streets.
Thank you, Vineet. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Martina Haggerty. As Director of Special Projects for the City of Providence, Martina oversees planning and implementation of a variety of efforts, including comprehensive planning, neighborhood and special area planning, urban design, environmental planning, transportation planning, and other policy work. Over the course of more than a decade of service with the city, Martina has supervised a diverse array of projects, including a complete rewrite of the city's zoning ordinance, Providence's first comprehensive affordable housing and anti-displacement study, launching the city's first bike share and e-scooter share programs, collaborating with RIPTA to implement the state's first rapid bus line and an enhanced transit corridor through downtown Providence, crafting Providence's Great Streets Master Plan and Implementation Guide, launching the city's Slow Streets pilot program in response to COVID-19, and implementing a citywide network of bicycle and pedestrian safety improvements. In 2019, Rhode Island WTS honored her as Woman of the Year for her contributions to the field of transportation in Rhode Island. She is also a member of the state's Transportation Advisory Committee, which guides transportation planning initiatives and statewide funding apportionments for the Transportation Alternatives Program. Martina earned her Bachelor of Architecture degree from Roger Williams University and Master of Science in Architecture and Urban Design from Pratt Institute.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Like I said, thanks for having me. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what Providence has done to make our streets more equitable since COVID entered our lives. Starting sort of back in April, we set out upon launching a Slow Streets program citywide. We were watching what other cities were doing, and our mayor and our staff were really interested in seeing if we could create our own Slow Streets program here in Providence. So we ended up launching a more than 13-mile network of slow streets citywide, really just focusing on residential streets at the time. We had just closed our city parks, so there really wasn't anywhere for our residents to go to get out of the house to get some fresh air. I think everybody was feeling really cooped up around that time. And so we saw this as a great way to quickly and easily test out creating some safe spaces for people to be able to walk and bike and skateboard with their families within their neighborhoods. On top of that, a lot of our sidewalks, like other historic cities, can be quite narrow, and that was making it really challenging for people to keep appropriate distance from other people if they're out for a walk or a bike ride. We were simultaneously seeing a lot less car traffic on our streets, which also meant that cars were driving even faster than normal. So, walking in the street to keep that distance from your neighbors while you're out for a walk started to get a bit dangerous in some areas. And so this is a picture of a family out there enjoying a bike ride. we even saw musicians. This picture in the lower right corner is a little fuzzy. I wish I had a better one, but it was really great. On one of our slow streets, we had a group of musicians set up and entertain their neighbors one afternoon. It was just, so we had a lot of these fun, spontaneous things happening along our slow streets. But one of the biggest decisions we had to make when we launched the program was where we were going to launch these slow streets. And it was really important to me and to us that we did this in an equitable way. At one point we sort of contemplated asking people where they wanted to see slow streets and then launching a program based off of that feedback. But we pretty quickly realized that that was only going to further contribute to inequitable investments by implementing programs where we had the most vocal residents. So to help us decide how best to roll out this program, we developed this heat map that you see here on the left that helped us determine not only where population density was highest, but also where our residents had the least access to private yard space. Sort of the 13 miles or so that we ended up with piloting. Like Boston and a lot of other cities, we also transformed several of our commercial streets to increase capacity for outdoor dining, and that's been incredibly successful thus far. We also worked with other organizations like the Providence Streets Coalition, who engaged artists and other community organizations to help further activate some of our slow streets and help businesses in other parts of the city. So they implemented things like sidewalk murals outside of restaurants to help with social distancing. They launched parklets for additional capacity. This is AS 220 in downtown. And they even held dance classes in the streets along some of our slow streets, which was really fun. Of course, this wasn't something that sort of came out of the blue for us. These were all things that we were already thinking about and doing and had been working on in some way for many years. We launched our Great Streets initiative, and in doing so, we really wanted to set out to ensure that all Providence streets would be safe and equitable and accessible. Central to this work was really the recognition that our streets are our largest public asset as a city, and that they form and reflect not only the character of our city overall, but of our neighborhoods and our people. And so this is a pilot project that we did along Broad Street a few summers ago. And so in 2019, when we wrapped up our Great Streets master planning effort, what we ended up with was a plan that lays out a framework for where and how we're going to make investments in our public realm moving forward. That includes everything from intersection improvements to traffic calming, new multi-use paths and on-street separated facilities, and neighborhood greenways or shared streets. In all, this 60-mile or so network is going to provide about 93% of Providence residents with access to what we're calling our urban trail network. And that's about a 450% increase. Just to kind of put it into context, you can see on the left our existing network. It's pretty sad. And we've started to build out this 60-mile network of investments. And so we're in the midst of this when COVID struck, and engagement throughout. And so it was a little bit easier for us to decide at the end of summer to pivot our Slow Streets pilot program from what was always meant to be a temporary pilot project to a more permanent change to our streets. A lot of our slow streets also happens to be neighborhood greenways that were already planned in the master plan. And so, like I said, at the end of the summer, we announced that we would roll back the temporary Slow Streets pilot program and start to invest in these streets with more permanent changes, such as traffic calming, striping, and signage. So you can see the network of planned neighborhood greenway investments that we're going to be making this fall and next spring. because this was already part of a master planning effort, we were able to fit these really well into our overall network of investments so that it makes a lot of sense. It's safer and more comfortable for recreational use, but it's also going to tie into this citywide network of safe transportation for people of all ages and abilities. And again, when we were looking at these kinds of investments of deciding which slow streets we were going to transform into permanent neighborhood greenways, we looked at things like connectivity. Does the street connect to an existing or a funded segment of the urban trail network? Access, does the street provide access to important destinations, things like schools or jobs or parks? And then of course we looked at equity. And so making sure that we are investing in our neighborhoods equitably to overcome any past injustices and harm that have been done, especially to communities of color here in Providence with past transportation and planning decisions. And, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the social justice issues that are happening right now, not only in Providence, but in all of our cities. And, you know, what shared streets really mean and who it applies to and who it might exclude. I think it's become really obvious the systemic racism that's so prevalent throughout our country. It's made it into the headlines here in Providence, and I'm sure in Boston and every other city in the country as well. But it really brings this question of who shared streets are for to the forefront of my mind, at least. You know, whether it's mobs of kids on bikes or mopeds or protests, you know, there's sort of this question of why do we view something like a cyclovia differently than a bunch of 16-year-old kids on bikes? You know, these are some headlines, real headlines here in Providence last summer of Providence bicycle mob blocks traffic, steals snacks. You know, it was just this question of like, if these were a bunch of white middle-aged men or hipsters, would we be saying the same thing about, oh my God, it was so terrifying, there were 100 kids on bikes? So I hope that's something that we can talk about this evening, and talk about how the work that we're doing can be more inclusive of the people who live in our communities, and how we can incorporate overcoming systemic racism through our work.
Thank you, Martina. And thank you for the many issues that you've raised that I hope we'll get a chance to address during our discussion at the end. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Leanne Taylor, who serves as the program manager for Walk Boston, a statewide pedestrian advocacy organization that works to make walking safer and easier in Massachusetts, to encourage better health, a cleaner environment, and more vibrant communities. As program manager, Leanne directs Walk Boston's technical assistance and community-based programs that aim to empower people with knowledge and proven strategies to make their communities more walkable. Leanne applies her public health background to her pedestrian advocacy work and views equitable access to safe, affordable transportation as a primary determinant of community health. Leanne has her master's degree in public health from East Tennessee State University. Leanne.
Thank you for the introduction. I am going to share my screen here. All right. All right, so I am going to switch gears a little bit from the municipal perspective and share the sort of advocates assessment of all of this. We just heard two great presentations from municipalities who were ready and willing to do this, and I'm going to try to put a slant on it, kind of this common-wide viewpoint of how maybe that wasn't the case for everybody. Shared streets shared streets looked really different for people. Some people are still struggling to figure out what it looks like for them. We have 351 towns in the Commonwealth, so you can imagine the ways this is rolling out doesn't look as beautiful as we might have seen in the past two presentations. So I'm just going to kind of share what we at Walk Boston have thought to be just amazing, excellent examples of these things, and then share some thoughts on kind of opportunities for opportunities to pivot, to keep thinking about this stuff. Also thinking about what does this mean for walkable communities? How can we make this stick? And how can we bring the people who are still behind the start line with us? So that's kind of the overview. So Walk Boston, despite our name, we're a statewide pedestrian advocacy group. Our work started in Boston 30 years ago, hence our name, but since then we've really expanded our work from the Berkshires to the Cape. And you can see we've worked in over 150 of the states and towns in Massachusetts. So walking during a pandemic, I'm sure many of you all have experienced this. It's one of the few things that we can all do right now. It's one of the few ways that we can be active and maintain our sanity. So our work is still going strong, maybe stronger than before. And we kind of, I think since March, like many of you, have been trying to figure out where do we invest our time, energy, resources. And these are sort of the three things that have risen to the top for us. And this is also the lens through which I'm going to talk about shared streets tonight, because that made sense for me. So safety, street safety has been mentioned by both of the previous speakers, but at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw we needed space to walk, and we needed safe streets for walking, and we needed slower speeds so that it was comfortable to walk. Equity, we knew before the pandemic that communities of color are not as walkable as wealthier white communities. We also know that they're not as safe for walking. People are more likely to be hit and killed if they are people of color. We knew that before the pandemic. We're seeing that now in communities across the Commonwealth. Capacity, I sort of hinted at that at the beginning, but capacity is wildly different to work on walking before the pandemic and of course now. People are starting at this from really different positions of resources. Some places do not even have a town planner. So we're working with teeny tiny communities who really want to do the right thing for walking, but they don't have the capacity. And we really saw that now's the time for us to provide the technical assistance to lift those towns up, to make them feel like you're strapped for time and resources, but it's still worth working on walking. So I'm going to talk about shared streets through these three lenses tonight. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be giving kind of the statewide perspective so that you can kind of see the variety here of these things and give the assessment of that variety. Many of you are probably well aware, but MassDOT has been churning out funds to get these things going in communities across the Commonwealth. And I'm going to just kind of gloss over this, but the idea was that communities could apply for MassDOT funds to do quick build, quick launch projects in the range of $500,000 to $300,000 to implement shared streets. They gave some guidance on what that could or should look like. They really, which we applaud and commend, had this huge focus on environmental justice communities to put the equity lens on it. Also, we'd love to see that there was extra credit for permanence. There was extra credit for transit. And this is sort of the outcome here at the bottom, which we are thrilled about. There's 124 projects in 103 municipalities. So that means we think that 124 projects could become permanent to make walking better, safer, more comfortable for people across the Commonwealth. But you can see the demand. 34 million was requested. This project started out at 5 million. They ended up distributing 10.2 million, a little more than double what they had set out to do. So the demand for these things, we think speaks to how willing and eager communities are to work on this stuff. If given the resources, if given the capacity, what would every community in the Commonwealth work on for walking? And it's really great to see that when given what they need, communities know what to do. And I think that's a real lesson here, is that it's really a resource thing. We have the commitment, people are committed to working on walking, but it's a resource thing. Okay, so that first lens is safety that I'm going to talk about. A lot of this is intuitive, but we were talking with communities since the beginning. One of our kind of roles in partnership with MassDOT and some of the technical assistance providers they hired for this process, some consultants, was to reach out to communities to help them think through projects in the beginning, especially environmental justice communities who were struggling with the brunt of the pandemic, struggling with everything there was to struggle with COVID, and having calls with them to say, what do you need? How can we help you think through this? This was some of the things that we kind of were pushing out for safety. How do you think about safety with shared streets? And this is what we were hoping to see in applications, which we didn't end up seeing in many. Obviously, creating space for walking. I live in a place with teeny tiny brick sidewalks. I did not have the space to walk. So we definitely were focusing on how can this be kind of beyond the streetery. We care about businesses. We really wanted businesses to be a huge part of this, but we wanted, as walking advocates, we were looking for space for walking, space for recreation. We also really wanted to provide assistance to people to think about, okay, you're putting in an application for multiple $1,000s, tens of thousands of dollars. When possible, put safety at the forefront for what you're applying for. And many communities did that. They thought about crosswalks, they thought about signage and lighting. They were thinking about these things so that it wasn't just a parklet. It was, how do you get to the parklet? Can you be there at night? All the things that we really think can help with permanence. We really were enthusiastic to see that a lot of people were thinking about connections. I'll talk a little bit about this later because I have some examples, but people were thinking about people wanting to move from place to place in their community, and maybe before there wasn't an opportunity to get there on foot or on bike, and how can we make that connection through shared streets? Prioritizing accessibility, I think this is an appropriate topic for this group, but this was something that we were a little concerned about at the beginning. Unfortunately, there were a lot of parklets going up. There were a lot of takeovers of sidewalks happening that didn't do this, that didn't have accessibility at the forefront. And we were gently, with our advocates hat on, helping people rethink what that could look like. Vineet didn't mention this, but he had a photo. Boston implemented their ramps program. So if you had an accessibility concern as part of your project, you could get a ramp from the city of Boston. A great way to help people out with the need for accessibility. I can say that I live somewhere where I now have to walk on a really bumpy part of the sidewalk, and the people are sitting on the smooth side of the sidewalk. Had that been flipped and we were walking on the smooth side of the sidewalk and the tables were on the bumpy side, would that be better for people with mobility impairments? We're still learning here. There's lots of things to think about, but accessibility as a priority is definitely something we're thinking about as walking advocates with these things. Considering a diversity of uses. So if you look at MassDOT's media announcements about what people are applying for shared streets, in the beginning it was all about businesses, which we were huge proponents of, because we know that walkable main streets mean you have to have destinations. And if all of our businesses go under, we will have nowhere to walk. So that was really important. We saw that, supported that. And then we really kind of, as we nudged along, wanted people to start thinking about, okay, beyond business, what can we work on? And things, what populations of people can we serve? What are we going to be looking at with schools in the fall? What are we looking at with seniors and how they're moving around, with teenagers and where they're hanging out? So we wanted to think about a variety of uses, not just people getting a $30 dinner in my neighborhood. And then committing to permanence. I'm going to say this on all three of my slides to come, but this is what we've been talking about in the beginning. We should not be spending $60,000 on something unless we have a plan for permanence. And we've really been trying to help people think that through. So the second bubble is equity. Like I mentioned, this is something that we were working on before the pandemic, but I think that Vineet's images and Vineet's description of what the city of Boston is working on with equity are things that we applaud. We kind of have seen in communities that it's number one in equity across the Commonwealth. So the first rounds of applications did not represent communities, cities of color. You see the more affluent white communities who have the town planner who was already thinking about this stuff. The first 2 months of things really were those communities. And then you start to see trickle in those communities that didn't have the capacity at the beginning or were so overwhelmed with COVID, start to roll in because people started to help, to reach out, to do the technical assistance. MassDOT hired consultants to write up plans for people if they didn't have a planner or didn't have the time. So the equity plug was there. But I think that, you know, this is kind of, this graphic, this is the lens through which Walk Boston thinks about these things. And I wanted to share it tonight because I think it's just a really good thing for all of us to think about, you as architects to think about as well. But shared streets are an example of a time when we can and should all be thinking about spatial justice. And there are all kinds of models for how to do that. But I think that this is a good one by Sita Low. Leading with racial equity in all that we do. We're charged with that right now. We have always been charged with that. But something that I think was a struggle for some of the communities that I spoke with was they were hearing this loud voice from businesses, which they should have been, and they were responding to that. They weren't able to hear from seniors or people with mobility impairments. They didn't have the time. They were putting in these applications quickly. It was hard to get resident input for where should these things go. And I think that a lot of communities ended up applying more than once because they gave themselves time to go back to communities and say, okay, we have street areas. What do we need now? We need an expansion at the park. We need a better connection between the senior center and the library. So they came back in round 2 to get the resident input. And then I think that we saw that there was a real need to be flexible. So when communities were hearing from residents, they might be hearing something like, we need traffic calming on our street. That's all we need and that's all we want. We want you to slow traffic speeds. And it was a push and pull to say, well, MassDOT wants us to do this quick build tactical urbanism thing, and we're not really sure what that's going to mean for traffic calming. But then they figured it out. So it was kind of once you get the resident input, and they didn't say something as simple as we want a street area in front of this restaurant. They said something a little more challenging. It was up to the cities to say, okay, we hear you, here's what we're thinking, and to do that feedback loop with residents. And then responding to resource inequities is something that I applaud MassDOT for doing because, like I said, all of those towns who didn't have the staff to write these applications, sometimes didn't even, people who had nothing to do at all with streets were writing these applications. And I think that MassDOT saw that a need was there. And so they hired consultants to help with design work. They reached out to us. I made tons of phone calls to people to say, what do you need? How can I help? I wrote applications. We all kind of pitched in to make sure that environmental justice communities were all funded. And I think that was important for this. And again, permanence, it's still being talked about, but we need to put the equity lens on permanence. All of these communities were struggling to write an application, definitely didn't have the funds. That's why they wrote for them. They don't have funding for permanence. And so that's an equity issue. How can we fund permanence? If communities say, well, this traffic calming thing really worked, but we don't have the supplies to make it permanent and we don't have the funds to make it permanent. We need funding. That's an equity issue for these environmental justice communities. We need to be able to have an answer to that. And then the last sort of bubble that we're thinking about is capacity, which I've hit on a few times. But I think that in some of the communities where these applications were the most user inclusive and equitable and considerate of the highest needs were those places where partnerships were already developed. For us, where there were walking constituencies already built, those were the places where we were beyond the streetery, where we had local walk and bike advocacy groups who could say to their planner what they wanted, what they needed, where there was already an inventory of needs for walkability. Those were the places who were ready to go. And so I think that knowing partnerships and having partnerships was something that really helped with capacity. But I think also just picking up the phone and calling someone to say, why aren't you applying and what do you need? It couldn't have happened in many of these communities that you'll see unless that had occurred. It needed the phone call to say, we see that your city's not on the list. We want them to be. How can we help? That's really what it took. And we had the capacity to help build capacity. And that's what we wanted to do. And I think that that technical assistance in doing that was really important. And I think also this sort of assistance to think beyond dining, not, the friendly nudge of saying, okay, you want to build that, how can you expand that to include a crosswalk or include a new RRFB or whatever we wanted to see. And then now I think we're at this stage where really people have been tasked through the MassDOT program to evaluate their success. It's a little vague on how to evaluate your success. And so I think we're trying to work with communities to understand how to answer the question of, did it work? Was it well liked? Can we make it permanent? Do we have the capacity to? If not, why? So I think now that we're at the stage of the capacity is needed for evaluation so that we can tell the story for permanence, so that we can get the funding for permanence. And so now I'm just going to kind of go over some examples of what we saw as some gold star examples. And I'm not going to read through what all I put here. I kind of bolded the things that I hope jump out to you. But when we were looking at these projects roll in, when I was reading and writing applications, these are some of the things that we tried to think about, which really just ties to this bigger picture of building more walkable communities. And shared streets are things that hit on all of these elements of walkability that we're always working on. And so really figuring out, again, how to make them permanent so that we can keep these 5 things happening in places where it maybe wasn't happening before or it should have been happening more. So connections, getting people from one place to the other. Destinations, parklets become a new destination. If you didn't have a park, a town green, many places don't. Now you have a parklet. It's a destination. You have a reason to walk somewhere. Safety, I've hit on that. I won't belabor it. Comfort, a thing that rose to the top for many people was, okay, we have these now, we have them in good weather, but what are we going to do in the winter? And they're identifying all these barriers of, you've created a play street, for example, for kids who live in a busy block, and now they're allowed to play. You've closed the street for play. And maybe you put shade out because you knew that they needed shade for the summer. But what do you do for heat? You still want kids to not be cooped up in their apartment. What can you do for year-round comfort? And then activity. This is, one of the many hats I wear is age-friendly walking, which is walkability for seniors. This has been imperative because isolation and being homebound during this pandemic has been a huge detriment to all of us, but especially to seniors. And shared streets have provided, I know in my neighborhood, our park is where all of the seniors are sitting on the benches, and I love it because they're not in their apartment. They're sitting there for the activity. The streets are closed around them, and there's people dining, and we have the space for socially distanced activity. But again, what is that going to look like in the winter? And what do we need to do as advocates and as municipal partners to make this continue? So this is the thing that I'm not going to read through because it's a lot of words, but I've bolded what I would hope you could kind of just, your eyes would be drawn to the things that were kind of the gold stars for these applications. And I tried to pick ones that were across the Commonwealth, from little tiny rural places to big gateway cities. But these are kind of the five things on the last slide are highlighted in all of these applications. And you'll see that many of these are environmental justice communities. And, the things that jump out, I think, are the things that make sense based on what I've talked about: connections to the places that people need to get to, like the post office, and to childcare, safety features, transit access, safe routes to schools, dedicated bus lanes, which we heard a lot about. And I think that, you know, things that are cost quite a bit of money that have been on people's radars, like curb bump outs, extensions, new curb ramps, crosswalks, and lights, the things that communities have said we want it, but we just don't have the funding for it. This was the means through which they got it, which we really love to see. One more slide of those, and lots of people put ADA compliance at the tops of their applications, which we were thrilled to see as well. Lots of slow zones, which we really hope stick, 25 to 10 mile per hour. We really hope those stick. And then I just want to share a little anecdote of how this looks on a smaller scale. I've shared, like, almost all of those applications we just looked at exceeded $50,000, but I also wanted to share how partners have considered stretching the dollar. And this is just a little example I'll share with you. Before the MassDOT program came out, some local foundations were coming together to say, how can we get people moving in the shared streets direction while MassDOT figures this all out? And the Solomon Foundation is a family foundation here in they work across the Commonwealth, but they're located in Boston. And they had a $10,000 grant program to do shared streets. And most of the ways that looked was creating what they call neighbor ways, which was just closing the street with materials so that we could create play streets, so that we could have safer routes to park, so the things that you think about. But one of the things that they asked me to partner in is figuring out what this could look like for seniors. A lot of people were explicitly stating what they wanted to do for homebound seniors, but they knew they wanted to do something, so they were trying to get a pilot going. I have a list of all the people who partnered with us in this project, but here are some examples of the very low cost way that some people are thinking about this. So this is actually how can people get from the housing authority, which is all seniors, to the library and to the senior center. Right now, they walk through parking lots, and pre-pandemic, they walked through parking lots. But this conversation made them think, oh, well, we know people walk through parking lots. How could we make that safer or more enjoyable? And how could we do that with these funds? And so just $10,000 brought together this group of people to think through this. And this is going to be installed in the spring, actually, but this is going to turn into parklets. It's going to have a little lending library, shade, pollinator gardens for programming. And we're going to kind of narrow some lanes to make things slower. And so that tiny little $10,000 idea that was 2 meetings and 1 walk and people thinking this through led to something much bigger. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of shared streets, and for us as walking advocates, the beauty of this whole process, which is that when people start to rethink pavement, rethink streets as places for people, that's what we want. That's what we're working on. And so that tiny little project idea turned into the town planner, the town manager having this grand idea to create a nature path where you're off-road to get between these places, to buy one of these little parcels of land to create a library park, to connect this to the town green. And they already have, at this point, this is a very preliminary design idea from the Solomon Foundation, but they're already looking at getting some dollars to actually implement this. So tiny little ropes in a parking lot led to them saying, we want this like multi-million-dollar project because we know that it's important, and we see that this temporary thing is something that we care about, and we want to make this permanent and really put our money to permanence. So that word has come up a lot, but this is where we're at. This is where we're at as walking advocates. We're really trying to help people with that evaluation piece. It's important that people tell the story. We have beautiful photos of outdoor dining, but we want tons of photos of how people are getting to the park, how people are moving from the senior center to the town green. We want all of those photos and videos so that we can say this transformed towns across the Commonwealth for the better, and we want it to stick. And these 3 bullets are what MassDOT's requiring of people. I'm wanting to add a 4th bullet, which is that all towns think about was it equitable and was it inclusive? If it wasn't, what do we want to do next? Because if you don't have great marks for equity and you don't have great marks for inclusivity, that just means that there are more project ideas. So I'd really love for everybody to add that piece to their evaluations and help them with that. And then this winter thing, I actually put, I think the BSA is a sponsor of this Winter Places challenge, but it's a current challenge going on to get people to enter winter street ideas, so that we can all get ideas of how's this supposed to look in the winter. Can we dine in the snow? Can we go to the park in the snow? But for us, that means winter maintenance for sidewalks. But we're always working on every winter, ramps and sidewalks, and we want to see where those are being plowed and how can we expand plow routes so it's not up to property owners. So winter maintenance just for walking in general is going to be a huge thing on our list. And then again, the last and final thing, I mentioned it once, but this shows communities, when given the resources, will work on this stuff. They'll transform their streets for the better if they have the resources. And so how can we get people to expand the funding? State partners, local partners, how can we expand and sustain funding for permanence and for new ideas that are more inclusive and more equitable? That's me. It's our website. You can learn all about what we do. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Leanne. Our fourth and final speaker is Lydia Housel. Lydia is a project planner and associate at Tool Design Group. She focuses specifically on building networks that support safe and accessible walking, transit, and biking, and is passionate about bridging transportation planning with related initiatives such as housing, health, and economic policy. Recently, Lydia has worked as a part of a group of technical assistance providers to help communities across Massachusetts prepare projects as part of MassDOT's Shared Streets and Spaces program.
Okay, great. Everyone able to see my screen? Okay, great. Okay, well, I'm going to close it up. I am going to try to hustle a little bit so that we have some time for questions. And also, just want to give a shout out to my co-presenters. I think that everything that you've presented on jives really well with my experience in this space over the past few months. And I'm excited to chat about some things from my perspective as well. So as Rami mentioned, my name's Lydia. I'm a planner at Tool Design, and over the past 6 months or so, I've been involved in street projects that aim to provide a rapid response as part of the pandemic to rethink our streets and in all the ways that folks have already touched on. And this work has come in from a variety of ways, but primarily I've been involved as one of the technical assistance providers that Leanne talked about through the MassDOT program that was funded actually through the Barr Foundation. And it's been quite the journey. So I guess I also just want to mention that I'm part of a company with 16 offices around the country. And this topic is certainly not unique to New England. So I'm bringing some perspectives from my colleagues as well to the discussion. So I know this seems kind of basic. My slides will advance. But I actually wanted to just get back a little bit the way that Vinny did as well to establish the problems that shared streets set out to solve, and the mechanisms that shared streets employ to provide some solutions for those problems. So I think the root cause, as we all know, was to contain the spread of the pandemic while maintaining some level of, quote, normal life and minimizing further marginalization of already vulnerable communities. And that manifested in a few ways in terms of new problems that we saw. So we have, kind of de facto new problems that we certainly weren't anticipating. For example, packed buses and sidewalks just no longer felt safe, not because of how they were built, because there were too many people. We couldn't maintain proper distance on the sidewalks, or buses that ran at peak hours with, headways that maybe weren't sufficient, just didn't feel like a transportation mode people wanted to take anymore. There were obviously immediate economic threats for small businesses, especially in the service and retail sectors. And then, Leanne also touched on the negative mental health impacts associated with social isolation and frankly, other pandemic stressors as well. And then, as others have touched on, these, some problems that existed and have existed and will continue to exist were exacerbated by the pandemic, including speeding and traffic safety, as congestion diminished, disproportionate impact on health outcomes, and housing and financial stability for Black, Latinx, and low-income people. And then also, I think we started to see some of the holes in our existing transportation system and how few options are really supported at a network level beyond a private vehicle. And so while there's been a lot of really creative solutions that many people have pointed to, and there are just, I mean, hundreds and thousands of examples from around the world, the ways that people really have attempted to solve for some of these problems are bulleted in my third column, which center around reallocating space to more pressing needs, which was especially possible given the lower and depressed traffic volumes. So just a few examples of how this has taken form in terms of creating new space. I wanted to show some examples locally, but also from around the country. So really runs the gamut from things that are as quick as some posts and sandbags to keep things in place, like we're seeing in Minneapolis, where they repurposed a parking lane to become more walking and biking space. In Cambridge, this is an Inman Square where they wanted to make space for more outdoor dining, but like Leanne was mentioning, managed to tackle some of these other adjacent problems as well. So they actually built a asphalt floating bus island, and were able to, you can even see they moved the bench out onto it, which is pretty incredible, and added protected bike lanes to sidewalks that have become just kind of meccas for restaurant life, with accessibility, in this case in Salem, made possible through a temporary ramp that leads people down into the street. And then other programs have focused more on the kind of slow streets approach that Martina spoke about. There's, in some cases, municipal programs that are fully dedicated to this, which is what we've seen, for example, in Oakland, and it sounds like in Providence as well. And then also, projects that came out of the Shared Streets and Spaces program, for example, that were not built on something at a city level that had any kind of legs, but that this really prompted. And so just to give a few examples of kind of how that looks. And to be honest, this talk was called an initial assessment of shared streets and healthy spaces. And after 6+ months, I can't say that I have formed even a fully thought through initial assessment of shared streets as pandemic response, but did want to share some reflections from my own time working on these projects, from not the municipal lens or the advocate lens, but from a kind of from the private sector, but also from a little bit more of a philosophical approach, and share, some of the things that I've learned or considered, and that others have kind of clued me into. So the first is that shared streets have really unlocked the imagination of what's possible and what's possible on what time frame. There's just been a huge response to the shared streets as a concept. We're having this discussion here tonight because that response has been so widespread. We're seeing it in every corner of the state and the region, across the country and across the world. And I think one thing that's been really fascinating that, again, Leanne touched on, is that we kind of expect the Bostons and the Cambridges of the world to be ready to go with this kind of response, but maybe not the the East Longmeadows and the Actons and the Cantons, which have all really leaned in to cheap and quick changes to their public space as part of their pandemic response. And what I think this has really done is unlocked the public's imagination and municipal imagination of how to respond to not only this crisis, but to others that have existed and will continue to exist after the pandemic is gone. And that shifting in thinking really opens up a much broader conversation about what shared streets are, not just as pandemic response, but as a response to things like traffic violence and fatalities, providing a quick response to those through materials now that folks know don't cost that much and that they can pretty easily implement, to things like preventative intervention, where you have a lot of near misses at a crosswalk, and we don't necessarily have to wait for something bad to happen. It could be, curbing the next wave of the pandemic, or it could be preventing crashes at locations where we know there's existing problems. So I really see this change in mindset as a win, and I'm pretty excited to see where it goes, which brings me to my second point, which is completely related, which is that shared streets are limited in what they can deliver. And in this way, I want to, reiterate that I have a legitimate excitement about the potential shift in thinking that I just spoke about and what can be achievable on rapid implementation timetables. But I think we also need to acknowledge what gets left behind and be upfront about what shared streets specifically don't replace, And I think there's a few ways that I see this playing out. By their nature, shared streets can't tackle important issues that are tangential to transportation. For example, we're not getting permanent light fixtures on new posts with underground utilities to help bring some more lumens to a streetscape. We're not necessarily planting trees even, which are part of traffic calming, but also part of the experience of walking and biking and being involved in your kind of civic activity, and as well as kind of our climate change response. And I think thirdly, and maybe most relevant to this discussion, lasting accessibility improvements have really been a challenge in communities where I've worked in terms of technical assistance, where they might be able to get a curb ramp or two, but the sidewalks leading to them are still crumbling, or there isn't a sidewalk, and there's that's been a pretty tricky one. And defining our threshold for what passes for a temporary installation, especially in terms of accessibility, has been a topic that we've discussed pretty frequently among tool design folks, but also the other technical assistance providers. And when we're talking about shared streets, I think it just leads us to need to be prepared to leave things on the table, or maybe compromise on what is good enough for now, even if those things are really important and maybe top of mind for some folks in the community. And then lastly on this point, I think that what this gets really down to as well is that shared streets and their rapid rollout don't replace a long-term community engagement or investment. And I think that all the ways that both Martina and Vineet spoke to how having a community-driven process in their back pocket made some of these installations more successful and more easily understood and recepted by the community really speaks to this. So we may be able to respond to urgent or even emergent needs through shared streets, but community outreach and working with community organizations and folks on the ground to build things from the ground up is still really key. And then a final reflection, how we shape public space during a crisis is an expression of our values. So, folks have really touched on this in all the presentations that preceded. So I'm intrigued to kind of touch on this more in the discussion, but in many discussions about shared streets, the priority of the pandemic as its own issue has sometimes dwarfed other related issues that intersect public space. Those other issues, race, class, housing, et cetera, they show up just as much in this work as they do in regular planning. And in some cases, I think we've seen it can undermine the concept as a whole. A central theme that I and others have consistently come back to is that much of the public space that's created through shared streets, especially related to dining, often comes with the expectation that someone will pay to be there. And that's a really interesting dynamic to bring to a conversation about public space and the potential privatization of it. And I agree with everything that was stated before about the importance of keeping people employed and needing businesses and small businesses to thrive in order to keep our societies functioning and running and maintain vibrancy. But I think that this can also represent a major access barrier and can undercut other efforts that are aimed at minimizing inequitable distributions or burden of impact from the pandemic. To give you just one concrete example that's been top of my mind recently, as we have been hearing so much about the kind of tsunami of potential evictions that are coming, at the same moment that we have restaurants encouraged or invited to take over space and build structures or shelters to help with winterizing their operations, homeless people, say in tents, have never been welcome in that same space. And it's just an interesting dichotomy and part of the conversation that I think is important and don't want to be left out, even though it's not the whole story, it's just a piece of it. And so to close things up, I guess these are kind of the big questions that I've been mulling over in my time working on these. How do we measure success is a big one. When I go back, think back to that first slide where I laid out the framework for shared streets and what problems they're intending to solve. I think that there's not actually consensus on what success means. And I think it'll be an interesting process for folks to determine for themselves and within their community and for MassDOT what success really looks like. And then piggybacking on that, how well have shared streets solved specific pandemic-related problems? And then finally, how can we reconcile some of that organic business-driven spirit of shared streets with potential privatization of public space? And what does that mean for the future? And then just to close things up, wanted to provide some reading lists or some resources for folks who are interested in following up. Some of these were actually also on Leanne's slides. So NACTO's put out a few interesting guides. One, the second bullet there, Streets for Voting seems especially timely given what's on the schedule for next week. The Winter Places Design Guide has some really incredible ideas about what winter's shared streets might look like. And then some articles and discourse on some of the more social justice or racial justice components of this work. I've linked there at the bottom as well. And there's some really good examples in that work. And so with that, I will turn it over to discussion.
Great. You know, these evening meetings are both easier to participate in during the pandemic and also more of a challenge as I hear my kids screaming on the other side of my bedroom door. We had planned to go till 8, and we've been chatting with each other, Rami and I. I actually have another evening meeting at 8, and so I'm going to jump off then. But we'll kick off the conversation, and I certainly think that folks who want to stay past 8 are more than welcome. If you do have to leave, the nice thing about Zoom is you don't have to stand up in the front row of the lecture hall and make your way to the exit, right? You just click off and you're gone. So I've been, as I said, I've been chatting with my colleagues and putting down just a couple of thoughts. And one of the questions that I was curious with to start is, for any of you, the presenters, has there been resistance to what everybody seems to agree has generally been a positive move, right? This sort of political will that we suddenly have, that we've been fighting for so many years. But has there been resistance to some of these guerrilla tactics, if you will? And if so, where has that resistance come from? And I think for the 4 of you, you should feel free just to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, this is Vineet from Boston, and the answer is yes. And that taking away of travel lanes and parking lanes has been a challenge. And for example, Tremont Street in the downtown area, where we are putting up a bike lane. I mean, I've been in a meeting with 100 people saying this is the stupidest idea ever. So it's not easy.
Yeah, I feel your pain, Vineet. We've experienced similar things here. It's been interesting because from my perspective here, we haven't heard as much pushback against the dining in the street as we have about bike lanes and things like that. So you take away everyone's parking to create dining or close the street for dining, that seems to be totally fine. If we even mention the word bikes, it's a crazy idea. So yeah, I would say acceptance hasn't been universal.
Yeah. The only way that Hanover Street happened was because we provided free parking in a nearby garage for North Enders who were up in arms and who thought that they really didn't want the outdoor dining.
Hey, this is Todd Blake, City of Medford. Yeah, the opinions vary widely on both ends of the spectrum. So as cities and towns, it's tough for us sometimes because in these circles, we're all speaking to the choir, but in our public forums, it's not necessarily the case. So for us, we were able to push forward with a lot of these initiatives because they were sold as pilots and trials, and it got people used to the idea. And then at first, some of them, you might sway some of them, but then there are others that are still adamantly against them. But overall, it's been positive, but there have been both sides.
That's great. Thank you, Todd. Another question that I feel like I should raise as chair of the Access Committee in particular before I sign off. Lydia, you talked about, what I think we can all see from the photos of this notion of what passes for accessibility and what's good enough for now. And to be clear, it's not only accessibility measures that we're deciding what's good enough for now, right? It's like, how cold do you want to be while you're sitting outdoors eating dinner before it's not good enough for now anymore. But I wonder if there's been any conversation about, as we talk about permanence, right? Is there a danger to allowing the good enough for now then to become, sort of a permanent fixture in the, in the reshaping of streets?
I mean, I'll take a first stab, but I think others can weigh in. I mean, I guess I would first say that the good news is that we have pretty bulletproof legislation that will prevent that. The Americans with Disabilities Act is very thorough, and for projects that really intend to be made permanent, I think that scrutiny will fall upon them, certainly. I will say, though, that this exact topic has come up so many times, and there is not a rule book for what accessibility looks like in this context, and it has required some deep thinking among myself and others to kind of work through that. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that, but I'm curious what other folks think.
So again, Todd Blake, City of Medford, the accessibility definitely came up for us in the outdoor seating aspect. We did a lot of research looking for prefab, metal ramps, wooden ramps that meet accessibility, and they're very cost prohibitive. We got a grant for outdoor seating for $30,000. We would have used it all on 2 metal ramps, I think. So we had to do bituminous concrete and things like that. And, hopefully there's some flexibility there. Obviously the regulations are there for a reason, and they should be. But yeah, working through some of these things with other cities, towns, and states might be a good thing.
Yeah, somebody mentioned that Boston had this program where we actually, using a grant, bought, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 ramps. And so those are available actually. Todd, we should talk because they were not that expensive.
That's great, thank you. Good show.
And so there were some restaurants who took advantage of that. They can be packed into a little suitcase. And then they just kind of flip open. But of course, there's a bigger issue of access in general, and I think that Lydia talked about that, and it's about the occupation of space, and it's about the monetization of space versus the kind of, and that was a huge discussion here in Boston when we did the outdoor dining piece, because we said if we're going to do this year after year after year, when things come back to normal, hopefully, this will not be a free program.
Great. Rami, I'm going to sign off and hand it back over to you. And thanks again, everyone, for your time this evening.
Thank you, Josh. I think if it's all right with everyone, do you mind, panel, to stay on for a few more minutes to answer some questions and
yep.
discussion, if that's all right, just a few
Sure,
minutes?
For about a little bit.
Yeah, no. I mean, I was thinking no more than 2 or 3 hours to talk. No, 5-10 minutes, I think, is about all we'll ask of you. I was just wondering, I mean, I'd like to get you all to sort of weigh in about this idea of what does success look like, right? And from each of your own vantage points, and it may be that I mean, so far we've talked a little bit about Boston, Providence, Medford. Is a checklist sort of, is it the same checklist in those places? Let's move to some smaller towns and cities in the region. Would it want to be the same sort of checklist? Do we evaluate these projects differently if they're sort of a seasonal thing versus sort of heading towards permanence?
I'm happy again to kick it off. I think that when it comes to measuring success, the first thing I always tend to do is go back to what the response is for. And it's, in this case, been explicitly tied to a public health crisis. And I think that that becomes really hard to measure. Were people still able to get to their jobs and not spread the virus? Were people able to have continuity of business and not spread the virus, which is I think those are the primary goals of what folks set out to do. That is just very hard to measure. There is just so much wrapped into it that we could never control for everything. And so that's, when I say that I don't even know if there's consensus on what success looks like, and it's maybe not well defined for everybody, that's really what I mean. In terms of some of the ways we might measure success, I think that I really like the framework that Leanne pointed to about projects that get things in the pipeline and have a potential for something longer term, and can build on community process to get there. And then I think the myriad ways that we could measure equitable impacts as well, were people who need the most getting the most, and that piece is a little bit easier to measure.
I wonder, Martina, if that last aspect would be something you'd like to touch on specifically, because certainly something you spoke very passionately about in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, it's we haven't quite wrapped our brains around it either at this point. And it was interesting at some point, sort of towards the end of the summer, the mayor asked us in regards to our slow streets program, all right, is this successful? Is this working? Let's end the streets that aren't working well and make the streets that are successful permanent. And it was kind of an interesting question, because the streets that, from a traditional perspective, you might think were successful. They had a lot of people out there using them, and the neighbors were really active and volunteering to help us maintain them. Those were the streets in our white and our wealthier neighborhoods where people had the time and the luxury to be doing these things. What we weren't really hearing about were some of the streets in the South Side or in our Silver Lake neighborhood in Olneyville. And it's not to say that those streets weren't successful, but what we did learn is that there's a lot more that needs to be done on some of those streets and some of those neighborhoods to make them successful. There needs to be a lot more engagement with the neighbors to have them feel ownership over these projects. And in some cases, there needed to be additional measures taken on the slow streets to make people want to use them more. Some of these streets were planned to be neighborhood greenways, and we didn't really know until we got out there and were experiencing them every day and watching people use them, that a lot of people were afraid to use the streets even with the barricades up, because of how fast people would drive once they got between the barricades and things like that. And so we're implementing a lot of additional measures when we make these changes permanent to help with those issues and help make them more successful over the long term.
I can build on that and say, the thing that's very difficult about working on walking is that we have horrible data to begin with. So if you tried to say, oh, well, we had really low rates of walking in Roxbury, did these new streets lead to more walking? We would never be able to know because we have horrible data. So this speaks to the need for good data to work on walking well. But I think some of the things that, like the measures that we really care about are related to safety. So especially in the cases of traffic calming strategies, if we could do speed studies to analyze did that really happen. I know that I've talked to a couple of towns who have already started analyzing their kind of road diet strategies, and many of them are reporting that there haven't been any changes to volumes of traffic. So some of the measures are rolling out to show things about the traffic calming piece, which I think is a little bit easier to wrap our minds around. Have speeds change, we can kind of do more of that. What we can't do as much of is like the perceptions of walkability, perceptions of safety. And so that's why I think it's very difficult, but understanding the user experience means talking to the users and really getting the feedback to say, we attempted to put a neighbor way in your neighborhood, but people didn't use it. Why do you think that is? Where would you like to see more of these, and how could they look different? Really just putting pen to paper and asking those questions of residents, because we don't have the data to say before there were 30% of this neighborhood was walking and now 60% are walking. We don't have that data. It would be wonderful if we did, but I think kind of getting the qualitative piece of the narrative, kind of getting the storytelling part is really what we can do, especially when it comes to funding. For us, for me, this is all about how can we keep funding going to keep seeing more of this so streets can become places for people, and we need the storytelling to show that we require the funds to keep it happening. And so I think talking to residents and doing the quantitative data where we can, but the qualitative data when we can't do the quantitative.
I would say one measurable piece of information is crossing distance or effective crossing distance. So the crossing distance curb to curb might be 100 feet in some cases, and by painting bump outs and using flex posts and things like that, you might be able to reduce the effective crossing distance by 50% or more. And that's one way, regardless of volume or speeds, we could help measure things. On our Mystic Ave bus lane project, we do plan to compare before and after speeds for general traffic, but then also reliability for the bus itself before and after. So two separate tasks there.
Well, thank you all. Does anyone have any final thoughts, questions, or Martin, would you like to?
No, I think some of the interesting discussions on equity and the different approaches towards equity, from Vineet's talking about really getting into the neighborhoods and getting those spaces for the restaurants that applied for them, to sort of the question of the perception of bicycle safety in Martina's presentation. I think it's great to sort of see that thread obviously going through all of these discussions. And I think we've all learned in the last 10 months to reframe our approach in that question, and to understand how any investments, whether they be temporary on their way to permanence, have to take into account that as a metric for how our cities improve and how we can respond overall to the pandemic. And I guess maybe it's a broad question, but just sort of more specifically, if there's any specific examples of what the folks who were presenting today, what their sort of ear to the ground and message on the street, if there are any optimistic tales for people who really do feel that their lives have been changed by the positive changes that have been made through some of these interventions on the various streets. I know there was the one great example that Leanne had of the foundation that gave money and created these sort of temporary walking spaces. But any sort of anecdotes, of thankfulness, I guess, from folks who really feel that we're moving the bar a little bit on this topic. I'd love to hear that.
I mean, we've clearly heard from restaurateurs that, this is great. And, but it's mainly from kind of, if I'm walking down Newbury Street, I'm talking to some folks there, and, and the moment they find out who I am, it's like, thank you, that kind of stuff. But I think that, and maybe Lydia knows something about this because she's in the area, but American Legion Highway, I know that, again, that was done actually really as a road type project more than a bicycle lane project. And we are measuring speeds, talking about measures of success. But there have been families there who I haven't heard personally from, but I know people from our team have, when they've been doing pop-up meetings and the like, that they've heard from people who had never ever got onto a bicycle, that they felt it was safe. And so I think that really part of the discussion here is that are we, by doing these projects, are we changing behavior over the long term? And I think that if you want to measure success, you really have to wait 6 months and see, and really then compare the before with the after. Because what we're seeing now is kind of responsive and ad hoc.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Vinny.
Well, on the consultant side, I don't know that I'm always in the room for some of the maybe, I don't know, happier discussions from restaurateurs who are so pleased. But I'm going to give a super personal example. There are quite a few installations around where I live in Dorchester, and also projects that are just related. So there's quite a large handful of, the Boston's has a slow streets program, which is their kind of permanent traffic calming program, which has things going in. And one thing that I think was really powerful was I actually recently led a community bike ride through Dot Bike, which is an advocacy organization. And we got huge turnout from folks who never came to these meetings before. And on we'd organized the community ride to actually kind of make stops around at some of these project areas to showcase some of the work that's been done recently or projects that are in the pipeline and how kind of they all relate. And people were just very excited. They didn't know necessarily that these projects were a thing, but they were all very receptive to it. And we just got so many more folks out, and it was a representative crew. I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and we almost get we very rarely get Black people coming to the Dot Bike meetings, and we had really great turnout. And so I think that there is increased awareness and even opportunity for education and more community dialogue about what these projects are, what they could mean, and who can advocate for them.
That's great. Thanks, Lydia.
I'll plug one more sort of anecdote story that the speed at which these things are happening has been has created waves of enthusiasm and catalyzed our kind of smaller little advocate pockets around the state to say, if they can move this fast, we can get them to move this fast always. So for example, there was a raised crosswalk that went in one weekend in Springfield, and the walk bike advocacy group there was just like, now we know 12 more and we know how fast they can go in, and we really want it to happen. So I think the speed at which things are happening, and that was talked about at the beginning, is really inspiring to people to say, okay, now we know that it can happen, and we know that it can happen quickly, so let's keep working on it. So I think that's been a great thing for us to see.
I think we've seen a lot of enthusiasm for temporary projects, for pilot projects. We've done them before in the city, but on a somewhat limited basis. And this was really the first time we had exposed almost every neighborhood in the city to what a pilot project was and how quickly it could be implemented and how easily it could be changed and how cheap it was. And so I think there's a new sense of, oh, well, we could just test that out. We don't have to freak out about the new bike lane going in, because we can test it for a week and see how it is, and we can move the cones and things like that. And so that's been great to expose folks that weren't familiar with that idea to it.
That's great. I think we're just about to lose some folks, so we're finishing up there. I think it really came full circle to. For me, what was so interesting to sort of to see, a couple of years ago, Sadiq Khan and doing these temporary things in Times Square, and all of a sudden transforming New York City well before the pandemic. And now we've come sort of full circle, and for better or for worse, it's given us a pause, but a reactionary mode in times of crisis, and we're doing the best we can, or at least you all are, and seeing some real transformations and trying to be, I guess, as positive as possible. So thank you for those answers. I wanted to try to end on a little bit more optimistic note. generally about the good work that you all are doing. So Rami, unless you have anything else, thank you all so much. It was really quite in-depth and great to stay on sort of one subject and offer so many different perspectives of that. And we really appreciate all of your time.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Great. Have a great evening, and thanks so much again.
And thank you for our audience as well.
As well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.